Today, our presentation will be on Japan. We will be focusing on the motivations for self-enhancement and self-esteem, and then we will also talk about self-serving bias, self-improvement, and then go into some examples on self-enhancement and self-esteem that relate statistically to Japan. The people that will be presenting with me, my fellow classmates, Jacob, Violet, Travis, and Janelle. I hope you enjoy our presentation. Let's get started.
Hi, I'm Janelle, and I'll be talking about self-esteem and strategies for improving self-esteem. Self-esteem is defined as the positivity of your overall evaluation of yourself, or in other words, it's the confidence you have in your own worth and abilities. Most people claim to have high self-esteem when asked, whereas only 55% of Japanese people report to have high self-esteem. This may be due to the fact that Japan is typically defined as a collectivistic culture. This means that Japanese people emphasize the needs and goals of the group as a whole over the needs and desires of each individual. And an individual's focus is on the success of the group and what the group thinks of them, not how they positively view themselves. This can have a negative effect on a person's self-esteem if they don't meet the group's standards. Hein details that research has shown that there's a direct correlation between independence and self-esteem. So those in individualistic cultures have to learn to become more self-efficient and therefore develop higher self-esteem. Moreover, differences in positive self-views occur by how people perceive things that happen to them. For example, Japanese find failures to be more memorable, which leads to negative self-views. And Americans find successes to be memorable. So they focus on what they do well, which increases their self-esteem. These are 3 strategies to improve self-esteem. Japanese do not compensate for their failures and utilize upward social comparison to judge their performance. This is defined as comparing your performance with someone doing better than you are. So, for example, if a Japanese person were to get second place in a race, they would focus on what caused them to fail so they can better succeed next time. An American who utilizes downward social comparison would focus on the fact that they still got top 3 and second place is better than third place. In addition, Japanese value tasks more after failing them. So the Japanese individual that got second in that race would value that experience because they would take that failure and work to improve on getting first place next time.
Self-enhancement, by definition, is the motivation to view oneself positively. And people tend to have a strong need to view themselves in such a positive light. So if you compare self-enhancement to self-esteem, self-esteem would be, how positively your view of yourself is, whereas self-enhancement is your desire to do so or your willingness to do so. So some differences between Eastern Asian cultures, like Japan, for example, some of these places lack such motivation. And a lot of that is culture bound in terms of origin, because the collectivist cultures like Japan, there's much less emphasis on the individual than there is on the group. So what this does is it creates the idea that you're not super special as compared to the Western world, where the individual is glorified and everything is about positivity in some way toward each individual person rather than the group. So, one of these is just because one study done by Kobayashi was that Japanese people will describe themselves in a much more modest fashion than we do here in North America and even Western Europe. Self-esteem scores were also lower. And then when talking about their personal abilities or in terms of their personality, they were all much more negative than Western participants. And again, that goes back to the collectivist versus individualistic culture dichotomy. In a collectivist culture, you're not going to be that focused on yourself or how great you are at something as compared to the Western world. So one of the big theories is that people learn motives for self-enhancement from the environment that they grew up in. So Japan being a collectivist culture, self-enhancement is not going to be something that's encouraged very often. That can be in direct contradiction to what we would normally see here in the US. So individualistic cultures are more individual focused. That's why Americans score very high on self-esteem scores on average. As long as, I mean, that's what the average is. So there is an argument out there that self-enhancement is a universal motive, but then culture is what dictates how you get there. So a Japanese culture that discourages displays of overt pride, for example, that self-enhancement isn't really going to be there to be achieved in the same way, or at least very easily. However, self-enhancement can still be achieved in places like that through persistence and achievement after failure. Japanese students, for example, are some of the best educated students in the world, despite how rigorous their curriculums are. It's because of their drive to finish and to be good at what they do, despite the adversity that they may face in their education. So self-enhancement, this is a figure displaying some research results comparing European Americans to Japanese and to other Asian American college students. This graph is an example of how they evaluate themselves compared to others, compared to the individual's best friend. So quick summary, on average, the Japanese students viewed their best friends to be higher than them across the board in their questions, but they would value themselves over the other students. So if you look at the graph, you see the European Americans, so that's going to be your typical Western world student, themselves are number one. Their best friends will be close, but they tend to still view their best friend as below themselves, and then others have a much lower standing. The Japanese give themselves a much higher standing than the average individual around them, but they tend to view their best friend as much better than themselves, which is something that's interesting, as they're the only group to do that in this study. And then the Asian American students across the board have higher scores in all three categories. But again, the Western world, you could claim, has affected them to where they score themselves much, much higher than the average individual and slightly higher than their best friend. Not by much, but the difference is there as compared to the Japanese students. So
the next concept we're going to discuss is the self-serving bias. And so what this means is it's one's tendency to exaggerate their own positive traits. In other words, they will tend to bolster their appearance both to themselves and to others. And what researchers have found is that it is actually lower in Japan. And so this means that Japanese people, they do not compensate for their failures or utilize upward social comparison to judge their performance. In other words, they do not try to come up with an excuse or some reason for why they failed. As you'll see, they actually use that failure to thrive and to push forward. They don't try to mask the reality of the situation, of where they are currently. They're not trying to, as I said previously, bolster their appearance. And moving on, they value tasks more after failing them. They see it as an opportunity to grow. And Japanese people also make more external attributions to their successes. So by comparison to Western cultures, they are, rather than looking inward and saying, the reason I was successful in this task was because of my own ability, my own capacity. They are, by comparison, making more external attributions. So it was the environment I was in, it was the people I was surrounded by, the help I got. That is another difference in the self-serving bias by comparison. And this next slide now more directly compares Western and Eastern cultures. So as you can see, we have a chart here, and this shows how much effort will be put into maintaining or accepting a positive or negative attribute. And so that is the y-axis here. And so two things we can conclude from this chart alone is that Westerners put more effort into maintaining positive than accepting negative, and Easterners put more effort into accepting negative than positive attributes. And so again, tying this into the self-serving bias, what this means is that the Westerners will put more effort into holding on to and exemplifying, putting forward that positive attribute. They want that to be seen. They want that to be attributed to them. By comparison, Easterners don't put nearly as much effort into maintaining positive attributes. And as we discussed on the last slide, they actually thrive off of failures. They learn from them, they grow from them. They don't try to make those excuses for why they failed and shrug it off, so to speak. So that's why, looking at this chart, we can see Westerners have higher positive, Easterners higher negative.
I'm going to be talking about face and self-improvement and how those two concepts can differ between cultures. So face is defined as the amount of social value that others give you or the standards associated with your position. Face can be highly motivating for many people, especially people who live in cultures like Japan's. Because Japan is a collectivist, hierarchical culture, the way that others perceive you is generally more highly valued than how you see yourself, and as a result, face becomes a really important concept. Some of the main characteristics of face are that it is more easily lost than gained, so it's much easier to make a lasting negative impression than it is to make a positive one, especially when you're living in a culture where there's a high standard of behavior expected from everyone. Another element of face is that it can only be increased by an increase in social status, and that it is lost by failing to live up to societal standards. So when you are trying to maintain or increase face, your self-esteem and the way you view yourself doesn't really matter, because face is fully dictated by whether the people around you see you as valuable and worthwhile. And finally, people are generally apprehensive about losing face because it affects so much of their social value and their ability to connect with others. There we go. All right, so in this slide, we're going to talk about how people go about gaining or avoiding the loss of face, and this is done through self-improvement. So self-improvement is defined as identifying potential weaknesses and working to correct them. It's basically the process of building up face or protecting ourselves from a loss of face, and all the behaviors and thought processes that go into that. There are generally two orientations when practicing self-improvement, and those are prevention orientation and promotion orientation. Prevention orientation is the more cautious approach, and it really centers around the avoidance of bad things like loss of face. Individuals in this category are more likely to focus on their failures in order to improve any weaknesses. And researchers have generally thought that prevention orientation stems from a high value of importance put on face, because then that individuals who feel that way tend to have more anxiety about maintaining their current level of face and not dropping down at all. Prevention orientation is the most observed in Japanese culture, which makes sense because face is so important in that culture, especially given its collectivist values. We see evidence of this in a study done by Hein et al. In 2001. They found that Japanese people who fail a task were more likely to focus on that task and to rate it as highly important in order to then achieve through that failure. The other orientation is promotion orientation, in which people are actively trying to advance themselves to gain face. This approach is more reward-centered and encourages an active seeking of good things. It's more common in Western cultures where individualistic values encourage an active pursuit of our own self-enhancement. In the same study done by Hein et al., American participants tended to avoid tasks that they failed and rate those tasks as less important. And this makes sense because in promotion orientation, the focus is on building up natural strengths rather than trying to fix any weaknesses that you might have. So this is just a little bit about face and how people seek to improve it.
I will be talking about Japan's response specifically to COVID-19 and the different restrictions and things that have been in place due to that, as well as some statistics, that have been placed and administered so far. So firstly, I want to start off saying that Japan's response to COVID-19 was fairly slow. The government did enact precautions and social distancing and limited the access to testing that resulted in a surge of cases in the beginning of the pandemic, as well as they've never had a mandatory lockdown. So the state of emergency did end on March 21st, but there are still the following guidelines in place. So they have strict traveling restrictions, plus a 14-day quarantine before and after leaving the country. They have social distancing and quarantine rules for residents, so just being careful in that way. And then so far they have administered 822,896 vaccinations. And then all of these restrictions are stricter in larger cities such as Tokyo, and that sort of thing, being more cautious where there are a higher population of people and a higher population of traveling people coming in and out of the country. So they're being a little stricter in those areas. The following statistics back up the concept that Japan, being a collectivist state and having more of a collectivist mindset, may have had reasoning behind not ever having a mandatory lockdown, as well as still incorporating stricter restrictions in the larger cities. So let's take a look. The cumulative cases total is right here. So it looks like 534,052 cases total. And then cumulative deaths is a lot smaller, so 9,641 deaths total. And I think looking at the deaths compared to their total population, it is a smaller risk when looking at it from a collectivist mindset viewpoint, looking at what it's going to help, who is going to help in as a whole, if it's going to help the individual person or if it's going to help the group. I think keeping things open and keeping the economy rolling and keeping businesses happening and keeping the trade happening in foreign goods and not having that mandatory lockdown, mandatory shutdown of all the businesses and things has really helped Japan. Though there is the risk in the pandemic, the deaths that have had happen are still crucial and still do affect people, but there's not such a large risk when looking at the whole total population. So I think that's a huge part of why they have stayed open, as well as why they continue to have the stricter restrictions in the large cities. I think that's a very good game plan as when it comes to figuring out how they can go at it the best way for the whole community. So far this is our presentation. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. Here is our references. I hope you guys enjoyed.